Greetings, state dignitaries, members of the Old Stone House Board of Trustees and Advisors, members of the community. We welcome you here today to recognize the 225th birthday of someone very important to our local, regional, and arguably national history, Alexander Lucius Twilight, the magnanimous and compelling headmaster and minister of the Brownington Academy, and the engineer and builder of the 4-story granite Athenian Hall dormitory, now known as the Old Stone House Museum. Alexander Twilight's life tells an important human story of willpower, perseverance, vision, and conviction. But what makes his unique story all the more powerful is that he was African American in northern Vermont in the 19th century, preceding the Civil War. Mr. Twilight's contribution to education, service, state politics, and the Vermont community serves as a beacon of hope for our own future as a state and as a country, a place where the virtue of one's dreams and convictions should hold greater import than the color of one's skin. We are so very proud to be the home of Alexander Twilight's story. My name is Molly Vasey, Executive Director of the Old Stone House Museum. I thank you all so much for being here today. Thank you to this event's sponsors, Hill Farmstead Brewery, the Brownington Ladies Aid, and the Orleans County Sheriff, Jennifer Harlow, for joining us at no cost. Many thanks to the Old Stone House staff for their tireless and fantastic work of this week of programs. Speaking of, I invite you all to participate in our other programs we've planned for this 4-day celebration of Alexander Twilight's birthday. Feel free while you're here to walk the Twilight Educational Trail, brand new, or come back tomorrow for its grand opening. Join us for the rest of the programs online. You can visit our Old Stone House Museum website for more information. Now, please welcome our board president and important member of this celebration, Carmen Jackson.
Today's celebration is the result of a board suggestion made 2 years ago that we could diversify our audience by highlighting Alexander Twilight's African American heritage. With the resources of the museum and following our mission to preserve, educate, and inspire, we have begun. We have a new state historic marker, a concurrent resolution, an interpretive nature trail, artistic installations, and educational programs, all to highlight Alexander Twilight, the man. This has all come about from the dedicated efforts of Molly and her staff with the backing of the board. I hope you find this afternoon's programs educational and inspiring.
Please welcome to the podium for our invocation, Old Stone House member and member of the Brownington Ladies Aid, Brownington Grange, and Brownington Congregational Church, Barbara Thompson.
Please join me in the invocation. Loving God, kindle our hearts with the same faith that impelled Alexander Twilight to come to Brownington, to live here, to teach, and to minister to this community. He knew that you are the provider of all of our days, especially during these times when we cannot be close to each other physically. Create a spirit within us that truly draws us toward you and toward one another. A spirit deep, perceptive, gentle, and bold. Your mercy, your tenderness, and your grace are only exceeded by your power, your glory, and your love. Be with us now as we seek to meet you here in this place and in your people here today, as well as in your people of times past. Clear our minds, open our hearts, and touch us with your presence. Reveal your purpose in our lives today as we look back in history and honor your servant, Alexander Lucius Twilight. Amen.
Please welcome our Associate Director of Operations here at the Old Stone House Museum, Robert Hunt.
It has been an honor to work on updating the Vermont Historic Site Marker here at the Old Stone House Museum. That program was begun by the Vermont legislature back in 1947, and the marker here commemorating the Old Stone House was erected in 1948. I would like first of all to thank the Vermont Agency of Commerce and Community Development and the Division for Historic Preservation, and in particular Laura Trishman, State Historic Preservation Officer, as well as Tracy Martin, Jenny Lavoie, and James Dugan for their encouragement and assistance with this project. It was not quite a year ago that I reached out to Ms. Trishman with the idea of updating our historic site marker to reflect the growing knowledge about Alexander Twilight and to put his name first and foremost at the top of the marker. Imagine my delight when she told me that there was money in the budget that year for just such updates, and so we began. I would also like to thank Carmen Jackson, Michael Murphy, and Catherine French for contributing to the drafting of the marker's contents, and Tracy Martin for final editing. The text was limited to 765 characters, and I believe we have left no spaces empty. I would like to now read the text of the updated marker. Alexander Twilight, 1795 to 1857. A Vermonter by birth, Alexander Twilight attended Middlebury College, graduating in 1823. He was the first African American to earn a degree from a United States college or university. Twilight arrived in Brownington in 1829 to head the Orleans County Grammar School and the Congregational Church. Elected as a representative for the town in 1836, he became the first African American to serve in any state legislature. Twilight began construction of a 4-story granite dormitory in 1834. For years afterwards, Athenian Hall housed young men and women attending the school. Area residents referred to it as the Old Stone Boarding House. Purchased by the Orleans County Historical Society in 1917, it was opened as the Old Stone House Museum in 1925. As many of you know, Alexander Twilight left Brownington in 1847 following a disagreement with the Board of Trustees of the grammar school. After a few terms without the beloved schoolmaster, it became apparent to the trustees that if the school were to be able to continue, it would need the leadership of Mr. Twilight, and he was asked to return. At a reception in his honor given in the Stone House, Twilight was able to forget past disagreements and stated, "This is the home of my choice. And here, with the blessings of God, I will devote myself to the interests of education." This theme of home will be revisited in a performance of the New State of Song of Vermont following this dedication. I would now like to introduce Curtis Reed, Jr., Executive Director of the Vermont Partnership for Fairness and Diversity and President of the CRJ Consulting Group. Curtis has been the driving force of the Vermont African American Heritage Trail, of which the Old Stone House is proud to be part of, and other state initiatives. We invited him to celebrate with us today and offer some remarks.
I don't want to have a fight between the fog in my glasses and my notes. So I've chosen to be able to see my notes. I'd like for you to indulge me for just a moment in a call and response. I'm going to ask you, how are you doing today? That's the wrong answer. All right? The correct answer is I'm looking good and I'm feeling good. So how are you doing today? Thank you. My father, every time I would call him or anyone would talk with him and ask him, how are you doing? He would say, I'm looking good and feeling good. I think I can do this. There we go. Yeah, so he knew that if we start off a conversation with a smile on one's face, it can only get better from there. So it's a privilege to be here with you today. And just to give you a little background, the Vermont African American Heritage Trail was launched on January 15th, 2013. So it's a little over 7.5 years old. And we created the trail along with the Department of Tourism and Marketing for the express purpose of, one, beating the drum about African American history in the state of Vermont to attract more tourists of color and tourists that were interested in cultural tourism to see Vermont as a destination. The second reason is for the purposes of educating Vermont students, parents, families about the rich and deep history of African Americans that have been in Vermont since the 1600s. There are now 30 sites on the trail. There are 11 sort of brick and mortar sites, such as the Old Stone House or Rokeby or the Clemens Farm, or in Grafton where the Daisy Turner story is being told, or Hilding. But the rest are state historic markers. And it is our plan, our desire over time, to equip each of these state historic markers with a CQ code that would you'd be able to download information, documents, videos about the personalities and events that the state historic markers commemorate. As I think about Alexander Twilight today, today is Sunday, so he'd be in the church. And I'm thinking, what would Alexander Twilight say today as a minister? And the one thing that sort of comes to mind over and over again is get into some good trouble. Okay. That, his life was one that challenged the status quo. And I believe that he would want us to challenge the status quo as it is here in Vermont. As an educator, I think Alexander Twilight would support the advancement of education that's anti-racist at its core. Right now, our educational system is producing a workforce and citizenry that unfortunately manifest racist behavior. Not all the time, and not in every circumstance, but these are products of our educational system. So we believe we need to change how and what we're teaching our kids so that we have a workforce that is that recognizes the economic opportunity with businesses of color in and out of the state, that recognize the importance of consumer dollars, of consumers of color, also the entrepreneurial spirit that could be brought to the state by folks of color, as well as those that are already here. And so I would believe that Alexander would have said, let's have an educational system that at its core is anti-racist and would produce the type of workforce and citizenry that be proud of. And then the last piece of Alexander's life was that of a state legislator. And I know we have several state legislators in the audience with us today. I think that he would be on the forefront of legislation that addressed issues of hate and violent extremism. That I recently had a briefing from the Vermont Intelligence Center, and there is an uptick, a noticeable uptick of hate and hate-inspired violence in the state of Vermont. I believe that he would want the legislators in the audience to address that directly in ways that protect citizens regardless of their social identities, that everyone can feel comfortable calling Vermont home. I've called Vermont home for the last 42 years and would like to call it home for the next 42 if I can make it that long. But in the meantime, I really applaud the work of the Historical Society here under your leadership, combined leadership. You've done a phenomenal job here. The first time I came up was in about 2002, 2003, and I've watched the progression over time and appreciate your new emphasis on sort of educational programs for young people and bringing a message of hope and a message of what it means to be a Vermonter. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Curtis. I'd now like to introduce Eileen and Phil Baker, accompanied on the dobro by Kate Wolf to perform our Vermont state song, These Green Mountains. The lyrics should be on your program. Feel free to hum or sing along.
Testing. That's on. We are honored to be part of this ceremony today in a beautiful day, in a beautiful place with a beautiful song. So this is our Vermont state song.
Not quite.
Dobro players, you know?
That was really quite touching. Thank you all. Now please welcome science educator at the Fairbanks Museum and Planetarium, Bobby Farley Rubio.
It's quite fitting that I come after the music. So it was a very nice performance, and thank you, Molly, and thank you, Drew and Leela, and everyone else here at the Old Stonehouse Museum for inviting me to speak. Well, I've worked at the Fairbanks Museum and Planetarium for nearly 17 years, and I am proud to say that I have lived in Barnet, Vermont for most of my life now, since way back in the past century. And I remember the first time that I heard Alexander Twilight's name as a 5th grader at Flamingo Elementary in Hialeah, Florida, on a hot day in February. Our class lined up to join the assembly in the cafeteria/auditorium where we had our annual celebration of Black History Month. And we were all handed the lyrics and the music to lift every voice and sing. And we sang in unison, if you can only imagine, all those elementary school kids, in a room stuffed to the gills, led by an elderly gentleman from the local NAACP who had a Robeson-esque baritone. Sing a song, he would sing. That was the part where we all sang the loudest because that's where we knew the lyrics. Unfortunately, we only sang that song once a year. But after the song was over, we would get the presentation about all the great Black heroes in American history. And just like all the schools that I attended in Hialeah, Florida, there's a working class suburb near Miami if you've never been. Flamingo's student population was comprised of primarily the children of Cuban immigrants, as well as increasing numbers of Nicaraguan, Honduran, and Haitian immigrants as well. In addition, a quarter of my classmates and about half of my teachers were from Black families that had lived in this country for centuries. As a kid with a Cuban mother and a Black father, I grew up surrounded by people who looked and spoke just like me. True to our native land, as the song ends. We were treated to that presentation, and I remember the heroes like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, Marian Anderson, Florida's own Mary McLeod Bethune, another educator, George Washington Carver, and then, quite noticeably, a name that stood out from all the rest, Alexander Twilight. I remember elbowing my best friend, also named Alex, and I started singing, "Nee-noo, nee-noo," until Miss Cooper gave me a stern look, and I silenced my song. You can blame my dad over there for giving me a love for old-fashioned television shows, like The Twilight Zone, but that's what his name stood out in my mind as a 5th grader. So, of course, thanks to Miss Cooper silencing me, I learned the most important detail of Alexander Twilight's life, that he was the first Black man to get a college degree in this country. And education has always been a huge thing in my family. So luckily, I learned that fact. And I didn't know anything else about Vermont. That might be the first thing that I learned about Vermont. It was just that state on the bottom of the list, at the top of the map in our classroom. Didn't know anything about it. I would never have believed if you told me then that I would one day find my life and raise my children here in Mr. Twilight's Green Mountains. And I remember the first time I met people from Vermont, Vermonters. I was a student at Amherst College in Massachusetts, and I joined the rowing crew because that was a sport you never saw in Miami. And at our first meet at the head of the textile race in Lowell, Mass, I met some students from Middlebury College. And they stood out amongst all the crews because their oars had the Holstein cow print on them. So I had to go up and ask, "What school are you from?" And they proudly said Middlebury, and one of the kids even joked, "Oh, we come from a place where there's more cows than people." And so already Vermont was becoming a wonderful entry in my mind. The file for Vermont just had a couple of things in it, but they were all great so far. So anyway, not long after that, I discovered that a lot of my classmates in college were also from Vermont. And I remember remarking to one of my friends, Nikki, a Seattle native from a Japanese family, I told her, "What is it with these Vermont kids? It's like they were raised by the nicest people in the world." It was almost scary to me. And one of them, a friend named Matt, became a dear friend, he invited me to spend the weekend in his family's house in Reigate, near Reigate Corner, in a very historic old farmhouse now. I grew up in Miami. Nothing was older than the 1950s when I was a kid. So to be in a house that was built in the 1790s, was better than any history book I had ever read. And my Vermont adventure began in mud season. But I was in love with the land, in love with the silver waters and the green hills, as the song says. And I visited Matt's house every single chance I got during every college break until I met the woman that helped me realize my dreams, Dylan Ford. Just like Alexander's beloved Mercy, my Dylan was born in New Hampshire too. Although she'll have you know that she was driven immediately from Dartmouth to her home in Reigate right after her birth. The same house where her mother still lives and where her relatives have lived since they came from Scotland in the early 1800s. And Dylan convinced me that together with her I could build a good life in Vermont. We began with the building of the house where we now live. It was obvious to me that there were very few people that looked like me amongst my new neighbors. Despite this, many Vermonters went out of their way to make me feel welcome. The first time I went off the road in the winter, during an ice storm in my 1995 Hialeah-style Honda Civic with so-called all-season tires, the farmer who is now my next-door neighbor, Sherm, was already waiting for me with a tractor and a chain. When I asked him, "How did you know I was going to need your help?" he said, "When I saw you going up the hill, I knew you weren't going to make it back down." Somehow, with neighbors that were still strangers, they were looking out for me. I felt safer here in some ways than any other place I'd ever lived. I didn't know what I would do for a living in Vermont, but I was a filmmaking major. And my first opportunities, just like perhaps Mr. Twilight's, came working with local schools. And I worked at Blue Mountain Union School and Barnett School. I didn't know it, but I was really starting to follow Mr. Twilight's footsteps. And when I learned of him, I only knew that he was associated with Middlebury College. I didn't realize that I was even closer to his real home in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. Well, after I started working in the schools, one of the local teachers, a great elementary school teacher named Barbara Elliott, invited me to be a part of an oral history project where I was invited to come into the homes of the oldest citizens in Wells River, Reigate, and Groton. Now, mind you, at that time, I had a wild set of dreadlocks, went down to my waist. And I was actually expecting to be met with a little bit of apprehension at the door. But everyone welcomed me in as if I was a long-lost grandchild. And I got to hear many, many lifetimes and many, many generations of stories from these folks. And even though I didn't grow up in Vermont, I felt like I had just been adopted by dozens of grandparents. So it was a great project, and it resulted in a documentary called History Through Our Neighbors' Eyes, which hopefully will soon be on YouTube, and I hope is a priceless cultural archive for the Vermont community, which first hosted me when I moved here. Well, like Alexander Twilight, my mixed ancestry has given my appearance an ethnic nebulosity that some find hard to pin down. I imagine Mr. Twilight was often asked, "What exactly are you?" I have. Some have asked me if I was Jamaican, especially when I had dreadlocks. Some have guessed that I'm Brazilian. And some just say, "What are you?" Like if I'm some kind of Martian. So, Vermonters are right to be proud of this state's history of racial tolerance and inclusion. But I'm no Pollyanna. I mean, she's over from Littleton, so that's another story. Vermont, the history of Vermont is just as troubled as the history of our entire nation. Or in the words of Alexander Twilight himself, much fruit which is unwholesome and injurious is equally certain. The Fairbanks Museum, where I've worked for 17 years, it features a relief of the goddess Athena teaching 2 children just above the windows of my office. And I think of Alexander Twilight and his Athenian Hall every time I walk in the door. Every time I have a planetarium show, I invoke his name when I talk about the twilight at sunrise and sunset. But I also know that the town of St. Johnsbury, where the museum sits, was founded by a slave owner who was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence, in which all men are said to be created equal. Jonathan Arnold came from Rhode Island to Vermont with a black slave woman known locally as Aunt Ruth, or Ruth Farrow. Whether her emancipation came from kindness, as the local legend likes to say, or just from the fear of Vermont's Constitution and the law, we may never truly know. So when I first moved up here, one of the first things that happened working at Barnett School, my partner Dylan was coaching a soccer game, and one of the young ladies on our local soccer team was from a Jamaican family, and another team from a nearby school started calling her all kinds of names. And that sounded like home where I grew up. That happened 5 times before lunch where I went to school. But the fact that that story made it to the front page of the local paper, and I found out I was in a community that was willing to confront this issue as opposed to try to just say, just get over it. That was an encouraging sign to me. Well, then I have to bring up what happened to Representative Kaya Morris in southern Vermont. And I've wondered if I was ever in a position where I was trying to represent my town, would I face a similar form of hatred to her? I know she has a lot of support in her community, but we're here almost 200 years after Alexander Twilight graduated from college, and this is still a concern. And I know that when I go and teach many of the schools in the Northeast Kingdom, even now, I might be the first person of color that some of these kids have ever met. So, it's not all perfect, of course. But what I've learned, every time I learn more about Alexander Twilight, I realize that he blazed a trail that I didn't realize I was on. He forged a path that I stumbled upon, as opposed to planned on. But still, nonetheless, people like him, I consider them pioneers and sort of the people who I am following here trying to be an educator in Vermont. So I found out that Alexander Twilight was very ecumenical, and he believed in teaching children from different religious backgrounds. He believed in educating girls and boys. And that I feel like I would have been in great agreement with him in most of his beliefs, but I'm not trying to say that I'm exactly like Alexander Twilight. I would never profess to have any kind of greatness, and I have never been involved in any religious ministry. I don't have any plan to, but I don't know if there's any other plans up there for that. And I have not served in the State House like Alexander Twilight, although I do know what it's like to earn the trust and the votes of your neighbors as I served on my local school board. So in so many ways, I feel like Alexander Twilight is a model for me in my life here in Vermont. So, there is one thing about Alexander Twilight that I noticed that was brought up in some of the reading I did. He never participated in any of the local abolitionist movements. And I can see why some people might criticize him for that. But I also understand why he may have wanted to stay quiet on such issues. Maybe you should just watch the recent show on Hulu called Woke, in which Keith Knight's roommate reminds him that woke rhymes with broke. He might not have been able to find employment if he had been too active politically, and I don't think he was in a position to speak his mind freely on all issues at that time. Some of us don't feel that way now. So nonetheless, I'm glad to say that the thing that brought me to know so much about Alexander Twilight is our mutual passion for astronomy. I only found out recently from Leela, who works here, that he was into teaching kids astronomy back in the days when they thought the 3 R's were the only important subjects in school. And that means he was ahead of his time. And it's just a funny coincidence that I did not know that, but the first time I came here as an educator was to do a star party 2 years ago, pointing out the constellations. I can only imagine if Alexander Twilight could see that, how proud he might feel to know that that kind of education was still happening right here in Brownington. And although we had a star party last year, we had to cancel the one for this year. I'm happy to say that I expect to be back next summer, and we can be talking about the stars and all the other wonderful things that I've learned since I've come to Vermont. Because what I've learned about Vermont, and I think Alexander Twilight knew too, is that this is a place where a person like me can get an amazing education. And it's not any more perfect than any other place in the world might be. But at least I know that in this community, you don't have to look like me to support people like me. So thank you very much for inviting me to come, and thank you, Molly.
Thank you, Bobby. It is my pleasure to introduce William Hart, Professor Emeritus of History, Middlebury College.
Thank you very much. You can hear me through the mask okay? Okay. I'd just like to begin by saying, in response to Curtis's call and response about how you're feeling, I'm feeling worried. I'm feeling very worried. Anyway, but to begin, I'd first like to thank Carmen Jackson and Layla Nordman and Molly Vesey for inviting me to be a part of this important occasion, commemorating the 225th anniversary of Alexander Twilight's birthday, September 23rd, 1795. I'd also like to thank members of the Vermont legislature and trustees and staff for taking time from their very busy schedules to join us here today, as well as the public. We've got lots of troubles on our hands right now between the coronavirus pandemic and growing racial violence and political tensions, and now the uncertainty with the Supreme Court. So I'm feeling worried. But I think these challenges make it all that more important that we are gathered here today for this celebration, to celebrate the life and legacy of this remarkable man for whom all Vermonters, indeed all Americans, should feel proud. As you've heard already, Twilight was the first person of African descent to receive a college degree from an American college. That was Middlebury College, where from which I just retired in June. Pretty good timing, huh? Yeah. He was the first man of African descent to be elected to a state legislature, Vermont, 1836. He served as pastor to a number of congregations throughout Vermont, including right here in Brownington. And of course, he founded the public school down there, Athenian Hall, as you have heard. He designed Athenian Hall, we believe, after Painter Hall on the campus of Middlebury College that was built in 1814. Twilight probably took classes down below where Twilight Hall is now. I'll say a few words about that, but certainly he would have had access to Painter Hall as well on the main campus. So we know a few things about Twilight's time at Middlebury. After working off his indentureship a year early to a local farmer in Corinth, Twilight took high school and college level courses at Randolph Academy, about 20 miles southwest of Corinth, between 1815 and 1821, so that he enrolled in Middlebury in 1821 as a junior. Now, before enrolling, Twilight had to exhibit proficiency in Latin and Greek, show skill in translating English into Latin, had to display an ability to do math and algebra. During his 2 years at Middlebury, Twilight studied Cicero, Greek literature, trigonometry, natural philosophy, today we call that physics, composition, and rhetoric, as well as surveying and navigation, astronomy, as we heard, and natural theology. Natural theology is the system of thought whereby revelation is thought to be revealed through nature. The text that seemed to interest Twilight the most was Paley's Natural Theology, which is a treatise by an English theologian that argues that God's truths are revealed through nature and human anatomy, that understanding the balance and happiness in nature reveals God's divine plan. He checked this book out of the library 10 times over his 2 years there. So no doubt, Paley's ideas informed Twilight's understanding of his role as pastor, for he often invoked the glories of nature and the ailing body to impart the lessons in his sermons. I'll just say briefly something about the cost of Middlebury College at that time. When he was a student there between 1821 and 1823, it cost him about, if you lived on just the college fees, the tuition and incidentals was about $26 a year, or $590 today. And if you lived off campus the way Twilight did, he lived in a house rented by Mrs. Deming, who took in Middlebury students to make ends meet. He would have paid about an extra $1.50 a week for room and board. So for Twilight to live off campus and study at Middlebury cost somewhere probably between $75 and $90 a year, or between $1,800 and $2,200 in today's money. Today it costs you about $75,000 to go to Middlebury, so big difference. One thing that is less clear about Twilight while he was at Middlebury is his racial identity. Now, I fully believe he was a man of color. I mean, we know he was a man of color, but I'd like to have us think about his racial identity in more complicated terms for a moment. Although we know that his father, Ichabod, was biracial and his mother was white, little evidence exists to illuminate of how Alexander Twilight actually identified himself, how he identified racially, as Bobby alluded to a moment ago. He seems not to have identified as black, nor did others identify him as black. And we can speculate why that might be so. Maybe there was a cost to participating in the anti-slavery movement. Maybe there was a cost of revealing yourself publicly during this period of colonization, during which free blacks were encouraged to move to Liberia. But regardless, we don't have good evidence to show us how Alexander Twilight identified. We today claim him as black thanks to the detective work of Gregory Heilman, who was the editor of Middlebury magazine, who in 1974 found the Twilights listed in the 1800 census in the far right-hand category that is for all other free persons except Indians not taxed. This category is for non-white free persons of color who are not Indians living on reserves. And that piece of information, plus Alexander Twilight's last name, led Heilman to conclude that the Twilights must be a black family, even though in all subsequent censuses, the census taker that appears at the Twilight household, and Ichabod is not there, he disappears about 1805, all the Twilights, Mary, all the siblings, appear in the white columns for men and for women. But based on that 1800 census and on Twilight's last name, we in the 20th and 21st century have assigned Twilight the racial category of blackness. And I'm okay with that, but we should also think about what it would mean to think of him as a biracial man. The reason I raise this to kind of complicate his racial identity is that I'm fearful of us succumbing to that old trope that governed racial identity in the Old South during the era of enslavement, when one drop of black blood, as they said, made you black. And I think now in the 21st century, we can think about race in more complicated ways. So I just invite you to think about that. Now, is either Middlebury College knew he was black and didn't care, or they simply did not know. It's puzzling because a few years earlier in 1804, Middlebury College awarded an honorary degree to the first person of color, Lemuel Haynes, who was a minister at the West Rutland Congregational Church, who was biracial himself, but he publicly identified and embraced his black identity. So maybe it didn't matter in 1821 the way it would matter in 1834 when Middlebury rejected the application of Andrew Harris, who then enrolled at UVM and graduated in 1838. But this creates further irony because just a few years later, Middlebury enrolled Martin Freeman, a black man from Rutland, Vermont, who attended the college from 1845 to 1849, graduated in 1849 as a salutatorian. There was no category called valedictorian then. He was salutatorian number one in his class. Tried to get a job for about a year in Vermont, couldn't, went to Pittsburgh, taught at Avery College, and right in the middle of the Civil War, he moved to Liberia and taught at Liberia College and became president of Liberia College, which is why Middlebury enrolled him in the first place. He said he would lead the black vanguard to Liberia, free blacks to Liberia. So this 19th century racial history of Middlebury, Vermont, the United States is very, very complicated. But for nearly the last 50 years, Middlebury has honored Twilight, a man of indomitable will and irrepressible ambition. Middlebury acquired and named the old public school building just below the campus, named the building Twilight Hall. For years, the college hosted a Twilight Scholar in Residence program by which artists would come to Middlebury for a semester and teach their craft and art to students. And most recently, through the inspiration of President Lori Patton and through the work of Daniel Silva, who's the Associate Professor of Luso-Hispanic Studies and Director of Black Studies, and Rebecca Irwin, the Director of Special Collections at Middlebury, and I have launched an initiative we're calling the Twilight Project. This is an initiative that invites faculty, students, and staff to research and present in myriad ways through scholarship, podcasts, performances, art, spoken word poetry, through whatever means, Middlebury's past challenges with race, gender, sexuality, religion, and other differences. I believe that Alexander Lucius Twilight, it's interesting that Lucius comes from lux, the Greek word lux, which means light. So Alexander Light Twilight would approve, as he was a man who embraced and engaged all persons, regardless of race, creed, gender, or nationality. Thank you.
Thank you, William, and we're looking forward to working with Middlebury in the future celebrations. Welcome next, the Vermont State Curator, David Sheets, for a few words.
It's a great pleasure to be here today on this glorious day. A little over a year ago, we visited the Old Stone House Museum with a busload of Vermont State House docents. And my longtime assistant state curator, Tracy Martin, had long guided this place before she worked for 10 years in our office. And slowly but surely, the State House has, over my tenure, been accepted as more than just a state capitol. When I came 42 years ago, the M word was never uttered. To acknowledge it as a museum was not its purpose. But happily, that has evolved and changed as the State House was restored and as our partner agency, the Friends of the Vermont State House, a private nonprofit that has worked very closely with my office over those years, we have transformed the State House and transformed attitudes toward it. And even the many legislators who know that it is their home, first and foremost, acknowledge this new rebirth of the building as a multi-dimensional, multi-purpose facility. And I see many of them in the audience today. And it's wonderful to be here in your midst, celebrating this place and celebrating in particular Alexander Twilight. 2 years ago, Mary Leahy, one of the trustees of the Friends of the State House, and I keep, by the way, making a reference up here. This is Tom Slayton.
I'm not Mary Leahy.
And Tom is representing the Friends today as their vice chair. Mary Leahy, longtime chair of the Friends, actually, agreed to chair a curatorial task force 2 years ago to look at storytelling at the State House. And acknowledging that if you're going to say the State House is a museum, then it must have something to do with learning and education, but it's also a state capitol. And so it's a building that represents democratic governance to all people. And if it is the governance of the state of Vermont that takes place there, then we have an obligation in particular to make sure that every Vermonter feels that it is their State House. So that was the big question before the curatorial task force. And we have two members of the task force with us today, Curtis Reed and Tracy Martin. And the work of this group slowly over those 2 years has been huge in terms of rethinking what the State House says to people and how we connect with those people. Curtis led us through an implicit bias training just within the month. And we're going forward with a major plan to write an entirely new interpretive plan for the building, to evaluate its stories and to make sure that they're the right stories and that there are stories that connect all Vermonters to their State House. It's a huge charge that I feel humbled to be a part of and to participate with the amazing people on the task force and the legislators who are going to be helping us with this process. But the Friends wanted to do something concrete, not just in terms of planning for the future, but to do something that would connect immediately with African Americans in our growing community. And just within the month, they made the decision to commission a painting for the State House of Alexander Twilight that will hang in that building and hopefully connect all Vermonters to his story and to the stories beyond. And we're here to make that announcement public. And yes. And we're here happily to say that the Friends were prepared to go out and raise the money for such a portrait. Around $30,000 to $40,000 is what it takes to do something really good. And within weeks of making that announcement, we had a major donor step forward. And so it's my further pleasure to say that the portrait is already paid for, happily with our longtime partners getting things done at the State House, the National Life Insurance Company, with Nancy and Chris Graff in particular to thank for that donorship. So thank you so much. It's a day of great celebration.
Thank you so much. That is very exciting. For the reading of the concurrent bipartisan resolution, Representative Orleans 1, Brian Smith, everyone.
Glad I'm not going to be the first one to take a mask off today. Thank you very much for Molly and Carmen for having me part of this ceremony. I'm proud and privileged to be here. And I would like to say before I read this that the state of Vermont's very fortunate to have a man like David as curator at the State House. Awesome man, awesome job. This current resolution was presented on September 23rd. Well, wait, I gotta put my glasses on here. I can't see what I'm doing. I knew there was a reason that I brought them. This resolution was offered to the General Assembly. Representative Strong of Albany, Representative Batchelor of Derby, Representative Higley of Lowell, Representative Lefebvre of Newark, Representative Marcotte and Representative Page of Newport and Coventry, myself, and Representative Young of Greensboro. It was also offered by Senators Rodgers and Senator Starr. Whereas in 1823, Alexander Lucius Twilight, a Vermonter by birth, earned a bachelor's degree from Middlebury College, becoming the nation's first African-American college graduate. And whereas in 1836, Brownington's voters elected him to represent the town as the nation's first African-American state legislator. And whereas, as a pioneering educator in the Orleans County Grammar School, he designed and built the 4-story granite Athenian Hall dormitory, now known as the Old Stone House. And whereas the visionary civic leader, educator, and minister enriched the lives of Northeast Kingdom residents and left an enduring legacy. And whereas September 23rd, 2020 marks the 225th anniversary of his birth, now therefore be it resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives that the General Assembly designates Wednesday, September 23rd, 2020 as Alexander Twilight Day in Vermont. And be it further resolved that the Secretary of State be directed to send a copy of this resolution to the Old Stone House Museum in Brownington. Thank you very much. I'm proud to read this here today. On a final note, I'm just going to say hi, Dad, in case he's on YouTube.
Watch yourself, Brian. Yeah, you're good. Thank you, Brian. Please join me next in welcoming to the podium Representative Vicki Strong.
Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all. I know many familiar faces. I want to welcome our congressman who has come today, Representative Welch, and thank you, Carmen and Molly and Bob, and I know the rest of the trustees are here, that this has been coming to fruition for a long time. And my journey in this resolution started many years ago, actually, when we, as parents of 3 young children, loved field trips, and we came to the Old Stone House or the Fairbanks Museum or the Calvin Coolidge birthplace, and I developed this intrigue with Alexander Twilight way back, and it has stuck with me. A man who was a legislator, a minister, an educator, and such an incredible person in his community. And so for the 10 years that I've served in our legislature, I've had his name in my heart and mind. And I thought, how can we honor this man? And that's what we do with resolutions in our state house. We honor those in our communities, our state, who have made a difference and who have served in very unique and amazing ways. And certainly Alexander Twilight has long overdue to have had a resolution. And when Carmen came to me and Bob and Molly approached me even before our session began, thinking way ahead to this day, how can we as a legislature honor this amazing person? I was privileged to say, let's do this, and introduce them to our resolution writer, Michael Chernick, who always does a wonderful job with our resolutions. We have wonderful people at the State House, David, who's here, our resolution writer. So many people make things like this happen. So Alexander Twilight was a really important person to me personally, and when this resolution found me, I thought it was an honor to write this. I've always had a love of the 1800s for some reason. My daughter, Heather, said many years ago when she was 3 or 4, she said, "Mom, when in the 1800s were you born?" And I was like, well, I was a little beyond that. But I truly love that time period. And Alexander Twilight lived in that time period. I'm going to just share a few words I wrote of why he has inspired me. Alexander Twilight was always looking for new ways to serve, and he is an example of rising above his station as a young man working on a farm, saving his money to later go to school at age 20, and he shone as someone who did everything to the best of his ability with humility and a mindset of faithfulness. His deeds of loving service towards his community inspire me and us today and give us motivation to walk a similar path to make a difference where we are each called. His example of a strong work ethic, a strong personal faith in God, a love of learning and passing that on to others has given us an example of a legacy that has lived on in our hearts and in our Vermont history. It's a legacy that deserves to be remembered many generations later and reflected upon, and gives us gratitude for the people like Alexander Twilight, who have made Vermont a special place to live and work and serve. Author Howard Mosier summed it up eloquently in a Vermont Life article a number of years ago. The Reverend Alexander Twilight, scholar, husband, teacher, preacher, legislator, father away from home to nearly 3,000 boys and girls, an African American and a Vermonter of great vision, whose remains today lie buried in the churchyard cemetery just up the maple lined dirt road from his granite school, in what surely was and still is one of the best places anywhere. Thank you all today for being here, and God bless.
Before our final presentation, I'd like to take a moment and read Senator Patrick Leahy's note he sent to us for this day. As you celebrate Alexander Twilight Day, I wanted to extend best wishes to you and everyone at the Old Stone House Museum for carrying on his legacy. Twilight, as the first African-American college graduate and legislator in the United States, blazed a trail for all those who followed. His innovative education methods had a positive impact on Vermont and the nation. On this important occasion, I would like to thank Vermont legislators who led the effort to designate a special day in honor of this outstanding Vermonter. Thank you for holding this important celebration. From Senator Patrick Leahy. And finally, it is my great honor to introduce Congressman Peter Welch for a reading of the statement for submission into congressional record.
Thank you very much. What a glorious day, really. And just to be here, this is a secret. Brownington is where it's the center of the universe. It's just wonderful to be here with all of you, my fellow legislators, Historical Society, David speaking on behalf of the museum / State House. And it's, you know, Professor Hart mentioned he's worried. I'm happy to be. We have reason to be worried, but I am so happy to have such a turnout of people who are dedicated not just to the memory of Alexander Twilight, but to what it means to us to have that inspiration to guide us through very challenging times. But what I have the honor of doing is reading from the congressional record in the House of Representatives, a declaration honoring Alexander Twilight. And I'll read that now. Madam Speaker, I rise to celebrate this 225th anniversary of the birth of a trailblazing Vermonter, Alexander Lucius Twilight, and to honor his legacy. Alexander was not only the first African American to graduate from a U.S. college or university, but the first African American to serve in a state legislature. In recognition of his contributions and his legacy as a trailblazer, the Vermont legislature passed a resolution on June 20, 2020, marking his birthday, September 23, 2020, as Alexander Twilight Day. Alexander was born on September 23, 1795, to mixed-race parents. His father, Ichabod Twilight, fought with the 2nd New Hampshire Regiment in the Revolutionary War. After the war, Ichabod and his wife Mary moved to Bradford, Vermont. Vermont's 1777 Constitution prohibited adult slavery, but the letter of the law was not reflected in practice. In the decades following Vermont's acceptance as the 14th state, black children were still held as slaves, and all black Vermonters continue to face the threat of being kidnapped and sold out of state. Against this backdrop of widespread discrimination, Alexander Twilight graduated with a bachelor's degree from Middlebury College in 1823. He's the first known African American to receive a bachelor's degree from any U.S. college or university. After he graduated, Twilight became a teacher and a minister. He moved to New York to teach and married Mercy Ladd Merrill. Soon after, he returned to Vermont to run the Orleans County Grammar School in Brownington. To accommodate increasing enrollment, he organized the funding and construction of a new school building to house and educate students. He also served as a local pastor, delivering sermons, decrying slavery and supporting temperance. His sermons reveal a man of strong convictions who viewed human history as a progression towards greater individual freedom, guided by conscience. In 1836, Twilight became the first again, this time as the first African American elected to serve in a state legislature. He continued to teach at the Orleans County School in Quebec until 1855, when a stroke left him paralyzed. He died 2 years later on June 19, 1857. The next year, Vermont passed a complete ban on slavery, declaring that anyone who entered the state was free. Today, Twilight's house, the school where he taught, and the dormitory he built still stand as part of the Old Stone House Museum in Brownington Historic District. His legacy as an educator lives on through the museum, where his ideals are reflected in the museum's educational programs, community services, and his personal collection. Twilight's memory is etched in Vermont's higher learning institutions such as Middlebury College's Alexander Twilight Hall and Alexander Twilight Auditorium at the Northern Vermont University in Linden. I hope that Alexander Twilight will continue to be remembered and celebrated as a pioneer who persevered against long odds. He should also serve as a reminder of how far we have come as a nation and how far we still have to go to achieve equality for all Americans, regardless of skin color, race, or ethnicity. Signed, Peter F. Welch, and that was in the Congressional Record. Before I make the presentation, I just want to also make a few remarks. You know, the speakers were extraordinary today, and one of the comments that Professor Hart was making about the mixed race and drop of blood, which in the South made you a slave, not a free person, and how complicated this question can be, as it was in legalistic terms. What's not complicated is the right that each and every one of us has to live our full life with mutual respect in honoring the freedom and God-given rights that each and every one of us has. That's what's simple. What's so significant for me today to be here in Brownington? I mean, this small community where people have come together because they do believe in the equality of rights for all people, is we're acknowledging and starting to understand that the legacy of our country does include the stain of slavery. And you know, none of us were present in 1619 when that first ship arrived with 20 people from Africa who had been kidnapped and forced into slavery in this country. None of us were there, so none of us could have done anything about it. But each and every one of us is here now, and each and every one of us has to decide what we're going to do about it. I've been inspired by Black Lives Matter. I'm inspired by it because it's calling on each of us to understand that this legacy, not created by any one of us, but affecting all of us, is something all of us together have to address. You know, when we saw that 8-minute and 46-second video of that police officer in Minneapolis with his knee on the neck of George Floyd, it was horrifying to see what can only be described as a bad person doing a bad thing. But what was also shocking is that as that officer was doing that, he had his hands in his pocket, He was calm. He was casual. There was nothing he had to worry about. And what does that tell us? This was not just the act of an individual. It was an individual acting with the full authority of the state because he thought what he was doing was okay. And what we have seen throughout our history, where Europeans came and settled, first displacing indigenous people who lived here, and then kidnapping from Africa people who wanted to stay home and were forced into slavery here. Through the Civil War, when slavery ended, and for 12 years there was Reconstruction in this country, and during Reconstruction, previously enslaved people were getting educated, were contributing to the arts and science, were serving in Congress, and showing the extraordinary talent and ability that, when given an opportunity, was unleashed. And then, boom, 1877, Reconstruction. Reconstruction, re-enslavement. It was the beginning of Jim Crow. In years where, through the law of the southern states, people were denied any access to liberty, and if they stepped out of line, were lynched. Now, each and every one of us knows that part of life is suffering. Everyone here has probably experienced something that has been a devastating blow to them. Vicki, some of us have lost partners, gotten illness, and we have to contend with it. It's part of what life is. None of us will escape it. Our time will come. But what should not be a cause of suffering is that it is inflicted on you as the result of the color of your skin. That is what we're fighting to acknowledge. And all of us are proud of Vermont, that our Constitution was the first that banned slavery. Rightfully proud of that. But as we look back on a day like today, coming here together to acknowledge Alexander Twilight, and we hear from the professor some of the complexities of his life, what we also understand is that we're honoring him and assigning to him some of the aspirations that we have today: to work hard, to overcome adversity, to treat people with tolerance and respect. That's the struggle, the daily struggle that faces each and every one of us every single day of our lives. Can we do that? No matter how much we're worried about what's going on, whatever the odds are, that's what we do as citizens. And there's nothing more basic. There's nothing more basic than each and every one of us, every single day, treating people with respect and dignity, and never treating them differently because of the color of their skin, because of their religion, because of their economic status. So today is honoring Alexander Twilight and the extraordinary efforts of this community. But it's also a renewal for each and every one of us to be so determined that we are going to do everything within our power to live up to the aspirations of our Constitution. So I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you today. And now I take great pleasure, Ms. Jackson, in presenting to Carmen the resolution that has been passed in the United States House of Representatives honoring Alexander Twilight, the first African American to graduate from college and serve in legislative office. Thank you very much.
I accept this declaration on behalf of those associated with the Old Stone House Museum and its mission. It will hang in the parlor of Alexander's house, across the street from his dormitory, and down the road from the church where he preached and the school where he taught. Vicki Strong and I are of a like mind in that we both were attracted to Howard Frank Mosher's quote. They say you can't have too much of a good thing, so I'm going to read his quote again. I like the way the stone house still looms up on that hilltop where the wind blows all the time. There it sits, unshaken and monolithic, every bit as astonishing today as the day it was completed. What a tribute to the faith of its creator, the Reverend Alexander Twilight, scholar, husband, teacher, preacher, legislator, father away from home to nearly 3,000 boys and girls, an African-American and a Vermonter of great vision, whose remains today lie buried in the churchyard just up the maple-lined dirt road from his granite school, in what surely was, and still is, one of the last best places anywhere. And if I have to give a charge, I guess it is, that would be, let's keep it that way. Let's make sure it stays that way, that is our legacy. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you to all the speakers. Heart-touching. Really, really great. So I'm so pleased. Thank you so much.
Happy birthday, Alexander Twilight! Thank you so much for speaking up. It was very touching.